Hey people, it's Ed EDDBUD here. Today I've got an initial review for you of the latest in the NOVABLAST line. It's the NOVABLAST 4, a lightweight daily trainer. Will this one make the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs? Or will we simply be running into a room of stormtroopers? Let's find out. Thanks for joining me people. ASICS have fired over a pair of the NOVABLAST 4 for me to review, though they won't be vetting my views before my valued viewers get to see them. The NOVABLAST 4 is coming in at 296 grams or 10.4 ounces in my UK 11, US 12. So you got about 13 grams more weight, so it's about 0.4 of an ounce than the NOVABLAST 3. That was a real favourite, that one, with its 37mm stack. They've added on about 4mm here though in terms of my measurements. In my size of the NOVABLAST 3 I had about 41mm in the heel. Here we now have about 45mm of stack in the heel area, and I got about 36mm up front. Makes her about an 8mm drop, which is round about what ASICS suggests this shoe has got. We're certainly talking max cushion here without the maximum weight. Quite staggering really to get this amount of cushion underfoot, and certainly coming in still around about that 300 gram weight. The Flight Foam Blast Plus Eco midsole foam that we've got here, I've got a Shore A durometer reading of about 30, so that does come in just a little bit over the average of 28. This does seem to be a little bit softer than the NOVABLAST 3. The rubber on the outsole actually seems different too. On the NOVABLAST 3 I think we had about a 67 score. This one has a score of 55 for the rubber, so perhaps it's a little bit of a softer formula. Slightly less in the forefoot area too. At the widest point I've got about 12 centimeters here and about 9 centimeters in the heel of the shoe. So less in the forefoot, a little bit more in the heel. We'll kick off my review with the upper first. Upper wise, there feels like there's a little less forefoot room here in terms of width in the NOVABLAST 4. I will still suggest that this is a true to size shoe, but it does feel a little bit more constrictive in terms of width over the version 3. Toe box is still very breathable. We've got some holes here, which we didn't have in the last version, and rather than a engineered mesh, we've got a woven type material. We still have that textured sort of material in the heel here, which sort of prevents your heel from actually slipping out of the shoe, and a pull tab as well, so that might be music to your ears or something you'll never use. We have a typical eyelet chain here, and the ability to tie up with a runner's knot, and the laces featured in the NOVABLAST 4 are a little bit thinner than the 3. They don't feel quite as sort of flexible. The gusseted tongue is once again back, with similar levels of cushion here, though ASICS have put a little bit more padding that creeps up a little bit further up towards the foot. So it's just a little more protection there from that lace tension. One issue I have encountered on my initial runs is some tongue slide, not just to the lateral side of the shoe but also down towards the front as well. It didn't really irritate me all that much. I did have to reset it after about 2.5 miles. That's probably going to cause some issues to some runners out there. There is no lace loop here on the tongue to try and prevent that from happening, so a bit of an oversight there. Maybe Mrs. EDDBUD can engineer some sort of solution with her sewing needles or something. Running today in some 2C temps out there, it was pretty brisk, I have to say, though my foot stayed reasonably warm even in those lower temperatures. You're certainly going to stand out if you pick up this initial version of the shoe. It's like an alien green. It really is quite something. Don't think it's going to stay this colour for very long. Aside from the tongue slide, I am digging the upper this time round. I think I like it a little bit more than the last version. Certainly comfortable, and it's easy to acquire a good lockdown. I'm going to give the ASICS NOVABLAST 4 a 2.7 out of 3 for the upper after my initial runs. We've got a top midsole now. This is now more of a max cushioned cruiser for me. The previous versions of the NOVABLAST felt like they had a little bit more about them. We got some extra weight here from that additional midsole material. I wouldn't suggest there's a slightly firmer feel, but it certainly feels different to the NOVABLAST 3. I think ASICS have tried to amplify the squash that we've got here in the heel and the forefoot. Again, they're talking about this sort of trampoline effect. I think I can feel that, though when I'm running at a sort of steady pace, I'm kind of hitting sort of midfoot. I'm not sort of collapsing into the heel too much. Doesn't really feel like I want to do that with this shoe. We've got a big heel cavity here where they've sort of trimmed out a lot of midsole material, and then again in the forefoot area of the shoe, but I don't think it's quite got that same nimble feel that we had in the Novablast 3. There'll be a lot of talk about the foam here. I think it's a little bit softer than we've had before. I mean, you've got about 4mm more in the heel and the forefoot, perhaps a slightly denser feel, but then again it's still way lighter than the Nimbus or the Kayano. I think it moves the Novablast 4 into a more impact protection type area rather than the very squashy versions of Flight Foam Blast that we had in the first and second versions. I have found that the foam here does soften up the more miles you put into it. I mean, it's still not the squash fest of the V1 or 2, but you got a more refined midsole here that I think is going to offer a little bit more to runners out there. This is a new version of Flight Foam Blast Plus, or at least the same one that we saw in the Gel Nimbus 25 or Kayano 30. Incidentally, those also had 4mm of extra stack height over the previous version, so the Novablast is in good company. Clearly the weight here isn't actually that much more than previous versions of the shoe, so the newer foam is perhaps a touch lighter, allowing us to get that extra midsole depth. I found it nice cruising around at that 8 per mile pace. It allows for some faster bursts, but I've never really thought of the Novablast as being a shoe honed for faster paces, in fairness. To me, it's always been that sort of slower, easier paced option. Just works well for daily stuff, maybe some recovery work or some longer, slower runs. That's even more the case now here in the midsole. More weight, yes, but it feels a little bit more focused for that type of use case. I definitely prefer the midsole here though over the Novablast 3. Doesn't feel quite so hollow, I suppose. Easy decision for me. I'm going to give the Novablast 4 midsole a 2.8 out of 3 after my initial runs. Outsole now. There's some quite considerable cutouts and crevices here in the outsole of the Novablast 4. It's a more complex arrangement, and there's many a place for dirt and debris to hide out. Now, it isn't so smooth in terms of the rubber texture this time round. On the Novablast 3, I found that smoothed off very quickly. Outsole grip certainly wasn't the forte of that shoe. The outsole does feel better this time around though. We've now got like 5 rubber sections that make up the outsole setup here on the Novablast 4, and they've improved the grip and traction in this instance. And I think where they've placed gaps in between the rubber sections, it's improving the flexibility of the shoe. The shoe is still though quite rigid and similar in that aspect to the Novablast 3. It does seem like we have the same outsole rubber depth as we had in that shoe. In use, the outsole has some great grip on everything aside from some icy areas on my initial runs. Is it better than the previous version? I think it is this time round, though I'd suggest it's not perfect. The additional ridges that we've got in the outsole rubber really are improving the traction on toe off, though again we have lots of areas for mud and debris to get caught up in, though in fairness you can easily deal with that with your firm bristle brush. After initial testing, I do have a little bit of abrasion up here in the forefoot area. It's the area around the middle rubber trampoline, if you will. Toe off traction really on point here with the Novablast 4. Just avoid anything that's very smooth or icy areas. It's just simply not that shoe, but I'm sure they've got a trail version coming in very soon. So big improvement on the outsole over the Novablast 3 for me. I'm going to give it a 2.6 out of 3 for the outsole this time around. Lowered a little for the early wear and the many nooks and crannies for hiding that debris. Value now. Now, ASICS have stuck with the same retail price for the Novablast 4, which we had with the 3. I think that's a really good job. Well done, ASICS. I'm glad to see this, and we're getting slightly more shoe than we were before, I suppose, so it's better value for money. I think it does bring the Novablast more into a kind of max cushioned territory here. It feels slightly like a cheaper version of the Super Blast, although that area is very heavily covered by ASICS with the Nimbus and the Kayano and that Super Blast model as well. Perhaps slightly into the realm of a Hyperion Max, although in fairness that one's coming in about 50 grams lighter than the Novablast 4, so it's like close to 2 ounces less heft per shoe. I think those after pure squash and perhaps less weight will still be interested in the Endorphin Speed 3 from Saucony, and I think there's probably a new version of that coming very soon, though of course that's at a more premium price point. As it stands, a good Super Blast alternative at last. Without the overtly light midsole, of course, we don't have Flight Foam Turbo here, and it's an easier to stomach price. I think the extra midsole here and the switched up outsole offer far better value to the runner this time around, so a good option perhaps if the Super Blast is just just too expensive for you. If you want a daily shoe that's got a little bit more cushion, a little bit more impact protection, could be ideal if you're doing some more long distance training for a marathon, for example. A 2.7 out of 3 for value for the NOVABLAST 4 is simply a bit more shoe for the same price, which is great stuff. If I've totaled the scores up correctly, that gives us 10.8 out of 12 for the NOVABLAST 4 after my initial runs. Are you a fan of the NOVABLAST series? I've tried out every single one. This is certainly going back towards what I wanted from the shoe initially. Going to get some more miles into this one, and I'll be doing some future videos with some very specific comparisons. Let me know your thoughts on this one down in the comments. Quick musical interlude for you. It's Christmas time, or at least it's coming very soon. You gotta have some Roy Wood and Wizard, though I've got a rare track for you to check out this time. It's called Rock and Roll Winter. You'll be able to find this one perhaps on a streaming service. I think it might have been a B-side or like a rarity. It's still got that bombastic Roy Wood sort of sound, huge drums, lots of brass, lots of woodwind. It's the sort of track you can imagine someone speeding along in a sled through the snow to perhaps get back to their loved one. Could have been used perhaps in a Disney film. They might have even got hold of Roy Wood at some point to try and get him to make some music for some Disney productions, but he declined and said, I'm sorry, I just can't, force that type of thing. It either comes to you or it doesn't. It's got all the Roy Wood magic here. You've got these amazing chord changes. The vocals are like searing. It's quite incredible. Remember the first time I heard this track, it was like, wow, this is like, I wish it could be Christmas every day, but not that song, but all the best bits from it. The saxophone work towards the end of this track is worth listening to alone. It really is a tremendous one. Rock and Roll Winter by Roy Wood and Wizard. Thanks for tuning in, people. It's always appreciated. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up like. My name's EDDBUD, and I'll be seeing you